She was 23, and the bank had taken everything. Her family's home, the land her father had cleared with his own two hands, the cattle, the barn, all of it gone, swallowed by a debt she did not understand. She was left with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small leather-bound tool roll, and $2 her father had given her for her 16th birthday. And with those $2, she bought the one thing the bank couldn't move and didn't want, the old black iron safe from her father's office. But what nobody knew, least of all the smirking bank agent, was that inside that safe was a secret that would unravel the lie that had cost her everything. Settle in and stay close for this one. We'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Tess Harlow was born and raised in the shadow of the Bridger Mountains, on a spread of land her father, Thomas Harlow, had claimed in '58. He was a man of quiet determination, with hands calloused from work, and a mind that saw the world in terms of what could be built, mended, or made to grow. He had come west with little more than a good horse and a set of German machinist's tools, a trade learned from his own father back in Pennsylvania. Thomas wasn't a rancher by birth, but a builder. He built their house from lodgepole pine and river stone, the joints so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. He built the barn with a mortise and tenon frame that stood against the Montana wind as if it had grown from the earth itself. He understood the mechanics of things, from the delicate gears of a pocket watch to the complex architecture of a wagon wheel. Tess was his only child, her mother having been lost to a fever when Tess was just 5. From that day on, she was her father's shadow. While other girls learned stitching and baking, Tess learned the names of tools. She learned how to true a wheel, how to set a fence post so it would stand for a century, and how to listen to the language of metal and wood. Her most cherished possession was a small, perfectly balanced ball-peen hammer with a hickory handle her father had shaped just for her small hand. He had given it to her on her 10th birthday, telling her, "A good tool in a steady hand can fix almost anything, Tess, or it can build something new." He was her mentor, her only family, and the center of her world. He taught her to read not just from books, but from the land, the way the creek cut through the valley, the story told by a splintered log, the meaning of a change in the wind. He also taught her about the intricate world of locks and safes. He had a fascination with them, seeing them as puzzles of steel and brass. He would bring home old discarded lockboxes from town, and they would spend long winter evenings by the fire, dismantling them, studying their inner workings. "Every lock has a story," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "And every lock has a weakness. You just have to be patient enough to find it." He bought the big black iron safe, a behemoth made by the Herring & Co. company, after a cattle sale one year brought in more cash than he was comfortable keeping in a drawer. It weighed nearly 1,000 pounds and had a combination lock with a dial as ornate as a drawing room clock. He'd set the combination himself, a sequence of numbers known only to him, and for years it sat in the corner of his small office, a silent, immovable guardian of their family's important papers. The deed to the ranch, her mother's birth certificate, and the loan agreements from the Stockman's Bank in Bozeman. When the railroad came through, the bank had been aggressive, offering loans to ranchers looking to expand their herds. Thomas had been cautious, but even he had taken a modest loan to buy a new bull and upgrade his fencing. He made his payments diligently, marking each one in a ledger with his precise, steady hand. Then 2 years ago, a brutal winter had decimated their herd. That spring, Thomas rode out to check on the far pastures and never came back. They found him by a creek bed, his horse standing vigil beside him. The doctor said it was his heart. Just like that, Tess was alone. She was 21, and the weight of the ranch fell onto her shoulders. She did her best, applying the lessons her father had taught her. She mended fences, managed the remaining cattle, and continued to make the payments to the bank. using the small reserve of cash her father had kept outside the safe. But it wasn't enough. The bank manager, a man named Silas Croft, with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them, began sending letters. The letters spoke of ballooning interest, of clauses in the fine print, of a debt that seemed to grow no matter how much she paid. It made no sense. It didn't align with the figures in her father's ledger. She tried to argue, to show him her father's careful records, but Croft would simply wave a hand dismissively. "Your father, Miss Harlow, was a better builder than he was a bookkeeper," he'd said, his tone dripping with condescension. "The numbers are the numbers." He produced his own set of papers, a blizzard of columns and figures that swam before her eyes. She knew in her gut something was wrong, but she had no proof, no way to fight the inexorable march of the bank's official-looking documents. The foreclosure notice was the final blow. It felt less like a legal action and more like a quiet, administrative execution of her entire world. Her father's work, her childhood, her future, all erased by a signature on a piece of paper. The day of the foreclosure was unnervingly quiet. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just the arrival of a buckboard wagon carrying Mr. Croft and a deputy sheriff. The air was cool and crisp with the promise of autumn. The same air that had always felt like freedom to Tess. Now it felt thin and suffocating. Croft didn't even get down from the wagon at first. He simply sat there, a portly man in a city suit, looking over the property as if he were assessing a piece of livestock. The deputy, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable, was the one who approached the porch where Tess stood. He held the official papers in his hand, folded neatly. "Miss Harlow," he began, his eyes fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "I'm sorry. We're here to execute the order of seizure." Tess said nothing. She just nodded, her jaw tight. She had spent the last 2 days preparing for this. She had packed a single canvas satchel with a change of clothes, her father's small tool roll, and a block of hard cheese wrapped in oilcloth. Everything else, the furniture her father had built, the quilts her mother had sewn, the worn books on the shelves, would be sold at auction. She looked at the house, her home, and felt a cold hollowness spread through her chest. It wasn't grief, not yet. It was a stillness, a suspension of feeling that was the only thing holding her together. Croft finally climbed down, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. He walked past her without a word and tacked a notice to the front door. The sound of the hammer was an obscene parody of the sounds of work and creation that had always filled this place. "The property and all its contents are now the legal possession of the Stockman's Bank of Bozeman," he announced to the empty yard. "An auction will be held on the premises in 1 week's time. You are required to vacate immediately." Tess looked from his face to the massive black safe, visible through the open door of her father's office. It stood in the corner, a dark, silent monument to a life that was now over. "What about the safe?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. Croft glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "That thing? We can't move it. Too heavy. The auctioneer can try to sell it for scrap, I suppose." He looked back at her, a smirk playing on his lips. "Unless you know the combination." Tess met his gaze. "No," she said, the word clipped and final. It was the truth. Her father had never told her. It was his one secret. "A pity," Croft said, though he clearly felt none. "There might be something of value in there. Or just more of your father's shoddy paperwork." The insult was deliberate, a final twist of the knife. Tess didn't flinch. She turned, walked back into the house, picked up her satchel from the floor by the door, and walked out. She didn't look back. She didn't want her last memory of her home to be the sight of that man standing on her porch. She walked past the deputy, who tipped his hat with a mumbled apology she didn't acknowledge. She walked down the long dirt track that led from the house to the main road, each step a deliberate, measured act of leaving. She did not run, she did not cry. She simply walked, her back straight, carrying the few remnants of her life away from the only home she had ever known. The cold administrative cruelty of the moment was its most painful feature. It wasn't a battle she had lost. It was a transaction she had been excluded from, a life liquidated on a ledger she was not allowed to see. She was just a line item, a debt to be cleared. The walk to the nearest settlement, a small, dusty town called Willow Creek, was 10 miles. Tess walked it without stopping. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the back of her neck. The familiar shapes of the mountains, which had always been a comforting backdrop to her life, now seemed indifferent and remote. She focused on the physical sensations of the journey, the feel of the worn leather strap of her satchel digging into her shoulder, the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the gravel road, the dry taste of dust in her mouth. It was a way of keeping her mind from spiraling into the abyss of what she had lost. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh, late summer way. The cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to turn yellow, and the air smelled of pine and dry grass. She had ridden this road 100 times with her father, going to town for supplies. She remembered him pointing out a hawk's nest high in a dead pine, or the spot where a grizzly had crossed the road the winter before. Now the memories were ghosts, shimmering at the edge of her vision. She felt a profound and aching dislocation, as if she were a stranger in her own skin, in her own land. She was no longer Tess Harlow of the Harlow Ranch. She was just Tess Harlow, a woman walking down a road with $2 to her name. She passed a neighboring rancher, Mr. Abernathy, who was mending a fence by the road. He stopped his work, taking off his hat and wiping his brow as she approached. "Tess," he said, his voice laced with concern. "I heard what the bank was doing. It ain't right." "It's done," Tess replied, her voice flat. She didn't want pity. Pity was a weakness she couldn't afford. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Willow Creek. Thought I might find some work. There's always a room for you at our place, you know that. Martha would be glad for the company." Tess shook her head. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy, but I need to stand on my own." It was a matter of pride, the last thing she had left. To accept charity felt like accepting defeat, like admitting that Croft had been right about her and her father. He nodded, understanding. "You're your father's daughter, all right. Stubborn as a mule and twice as strong." He reached into his pocket. "Here, let me give you." "No," she said, holding up a hand. "Thank you, but no." She continued on her way, leaving the kind offer behind her. She knew she couldn't stay in the valley. Every hill, every tree, every bend in the creek was a memory of her father, and the life that had been stolen from her. To stay would be to live as a ghost among the ruins of her own past. Willow Creek was not much of a town. It consisted of a single dusty street lined with a dozen wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small hotel, and a livery stable. People turned to watch her as she walked down the street, her face smudged with dust, her satchel slung over her shoulder. The news of the Harlow foreclosure had traveled fast. She ignored their stares and went directly to the livery. The owner, a man named Jed, knew her father. She arranged to board there for a few nights, paying for a spot in the hayloft with one of her $2 silver. It was a clean, warm space, and the smell of hay and horses was comforting in its familiarity. For the next week, she existed in a state of limbo. She took small jobs, mucking out stalls, helping unload a freight wagon, for enough money to buy food. Each evening, she would sit in the hayloft, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and take out her father's tool roll. She would unroll the leather, her fingers tracing the familiar shapes of the files, the chisels, the small, perfect hammer. She would clean and oil each one, not because they needed it, but because the ritual was calming. It was a connection to him, a reminder of the competence and self-reliance he had taught her. The auction was set for Saturday. A part of her wanted to stay away, to sever the final tie. But another, more stubborn part refused to let go completely. She had to see it through to the end. On Saturday morning, She walked the 10 miles back to the ranch. She arrived to find a small crowd of wagons and horses gathered in the yard. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man from Bozeman, was standing on the porch, already well into his spiel. He was selling off her life piece by piece. The kitchen table where she and her father had eaten every meal. The rocking chair he had sat in by the fire. She watched with a detached coldness as neighbors and strangers bid on the intimate details of her past. Mr. Abernathy was there, and she saw him buy her mother's quilting frame. He caught her eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and she understood he was buying it to keep it safe for her. It was a small act of kindness that threatened to crack the shell of composure she had so carefully constructed. Finally, the auctioneer was done with the household goods. He gestured with a dismissive thumb toward the open office door. All right, folks, one last item. An old herring iron safe. Weighs a ton. Combinations lost. We're selling it as is. Where is? Good for scrap iron, I suppose. What am I bid for this fine piece of scrap? Silence. No one wanted the hassle of moving a 1,000-pound block of iron. Come on now. The auctioneer cajoled. Let's start the bidding at $5. $5 for a half-ton of iron. More silence. The crowd shifted, ready to leave. Mr. Croft, who had been observing from the side, let out an impatient sigh. Just get on with it, he muttered. $1. The auctioneer tried, desperation creeping into his voice. Who'll give me $1? Tess stepped forward. The crowd parted to let her through. All eyes were on her. Her heart was pounding, but her voice came out clear and steady. I have $2. She held up the single remaining silver dollar from her father. The other was already spent on her lodging. But the auctioneer didn't know that. She was bidding her entire net worth. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Croft stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and contempt. What could she possibly want with it? The auctioneer looked from her to the crowd, then back again. $2 from the young lady. Do I hear $3? $2 for this magnificent paperweight. He waited. No one else bid. It was a gesture of respect from the locals, a silent refusal to bid against the dispossessed daughter. Sold, the auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel down on the porch railing. To Miss Harlow for $2. Croft strode over to her, his face flushed with anger. What is this, a joke? What are you going to do with that? It's mine now, Tess said simply. She walked over to the auctioneer and handed him her last silver dollar. I'll need a receipt, she said. The man, surprised at her formality, scribbled one out on a piece of paper. 1-1, herring safe, as is, sold to Tess Harlow for the sum of $2. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. It was the first thing she had owned in a week. As the crowd dispersed, leaving her alone in the yard of her former home, she walked into the office and stood before the safe. It was enormous, 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, its black paint chipped and scarred. The dial was polished brass, the numbers and letters engraved with painstaking artistry. It was a thing of substance, a thing of permanence. It had been her father's, and now it was hers. She ran a hand over its cold, unyielding surface. She didn't know the combination. She didn't know if there was anything inside besides old papers. But it was the only piece of her father, of her home, that the bank had not been able to take. It was an anchor in the storm of her life, and she had just bought it for everything she had. For the next few days, the safe sat in the empty office while Tess camped in the barn, living off the last of her cheese and the kindness of Mrs. Abernathy, who brought her a basket of food. She spent hours just looking at the safe, running her hands over its riveted steel plates. She thought about her father, about their evenings spent dismantling locks. Every lock has a story, he'd said, and every lock has a weakness. This was the ultimate puzzle he had left her. She knew brute force was useless. The safe was designed to resist it. Dynamite would destroy the contents. The secret was in the mechanism itself. She began by cleaning it. She used a soft cloth and oil, meticulously wiping away years of dust from every inch of its surface. She cleaned the ornate hinges and the polished brass dial, feeling the faint clicks as she turned it. This was an act of respect, of preparation. It was how her father had always begun any delicate work. Then, she retrieved his tool roll. She laid the worn leather flat on the floor and looked at the familiar instruments. The slender files, the hardened steel picks, the calipers, and the small, perfectly balanced hammer. These were not just tools. They were an extension of her father's mind, his hands. She picked up a thin steel probe and a listening rod, a simple device her father had fashioned from a length of dowel and a metal diaphragm like a doctor's stethoscope. She knelt before the safe, placing the end of the rod against the door just beside the dial. She put the other end to her ear, closed her eyes, and began to turn the combination dial. She was listening for the tumblers. Her father had taught her the theory. A combination lock was a series of wheels, or tumblers, each with a notch. When the correct combination was dialed, all the notches would align, allowing the locking bolt to retract. Each tumbler made a faint, almost imperceptible click as it fell into place. The trick was to isolate that sound from all the other mechanical noise. The first day, she heard nothing but a confusing whir of moving parts. Her concentration was broken by frustration and grief. She was trying too hard, listening with her anger instead of her ears. That evening, she walked out into the pasture and watched the stars come out. She thought of her father's patience, the calm, unhurried way he would approach a problem. "You can't force it, Tess," he would say. "You have to feel it. Listen to what the metal is telling you." The next morning she tried again. This time she was calm. She breathed slowly, emptying her mind of everything but the task at hand. She turned the dial slowly, a fraction of an inch at a time. The world narrowed to the space between her ear and the cold steel of the safe. Click, whir, click. And then she heard it. A sound so faint it was more a feeling than a noise. A tiny, metallic thunk as the first tumbler settled into its gate. She froze, marking the number on the dial with a piece of chalk. 27. Hope, sharp and sudden, pierced through her numbness. She had found the first number. The process was painstaking. She had to work the tumblers back and forth, isolating the sound of each one falling. It took her 2 more days. She learned the language of this specific lock, the unique signature of its inner world. The second number was 51. The third was 14. Finally, on the 4th day, she found the last number, 83. Her hand trembled as she turned the dial one last time, aligning the final number. She held her breath and reached for the handle. It was heavy, made of cast iron. She pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning sound of metal on metal, the massive bolts retracted. The heavy door swung open. The air that wafted out was cool and smelled of old paper and leather. She peered inside. The interior was lined with dark, polished wood. There were several small drawers and a single, large compartment. In the main compartment sat a thick, leather-bound ledger, her father's financial records, and a stack of official-looking documents tied with a ribbon. Beside them was a small, velvet-lined box, and on top of the ledger was a single sealed envelope. Her name, Tess, was written on it in her father's familiar, steady script. Her hands shook as she reached for the letter. She sat on the floor of the empty office and broke the seal. The letter was dated just a month before he died. "My dearest Tess," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it also means you have opened this safe. I knew you could. You have my hands in a better mind than I ever did. There are things I must tell you. I have not been honest about the state of our finances, not because I wished to deceive you, but to protect you. The loan from the Stockman's Bank is not what it seems. Mr. Croft is a thief. He has been altering the loan documents for years, forging my signature on amendments and adding fees that do not exist. I discovered it too late. The original loan agreement is in this safe. along with every receipt for every payment I ever made. Compare them to the bank's records. The truth is in the ink and the paper. I was gathering proof to fight him, but my heart, I fear, is not as strong as it once was. In the small box, you will find what remains of your mother's jewelry and a small savings of gold coin. It is not much, but it is clean money, untouched by the bank. Use it to hire a lawyer. Do not let that man steal our home. This ranch is your birthright, built with our hands and our love. Fight for it. You are stronger than you know. All my love, Father. Tess's composure finally broke. A single tear, then another, traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. They were not tears of grief, but of vindication. And of love he had known. He had trusted her to find this. She wiped her eyes and reached back into the safe. She pulled out the stack of documents. There it was, the original loan signed in her father's hand. The interest rate was a fraction of what Croft had claimed. She then looked at the forged documents her father had somehow obtained. The signature was close, but not perfect. The T in Thomas was just a little too ornate, the loop on the H in Harlow a little too shaky. It was the work of a forger, not a penman. And then she saw the ledger, her father's meticulous records. Every payment, every date, cross-referenced and clear. It was all here, the proof, the weapon she needed. Her father hadn't left her with a puzzle. He had left her with a key. Armed with the contents of the safe, Tess felt a surge of purpose she hadn't felt since her father's death. The numbness was gone, replaced by a cold, clear anger. This was no longer just about loss. It was about justice. The next morning, she rode Mr. Abernathy's spare horse into Bozeman. The original loan documents, her father's ledger, and the forgeries wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked into her satchel. The gold coins from the velvet box were hidden in a pouch tied around her waist. She didn't go to the bank. She went to the office of the town's most respected lawyer, a man named Elias Thorne, an old friend of her father's. Thorne was a stern, silver-haired man with a reputation for honesty and a deep dislike for the town's new money sharks. He listened patiently as Tess laid out the story, her voice never wavering. She placed the documents on his desk, the original loan, the forged amendments, and her father's ledger. Thorne spent nearly an hour examining the papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. He held the signatures up to the light. He compared the ink. He cross-referenced the dates in the ledger with the bank's stated claims. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and looked at Tess. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. Thomas was always a meticulous man, he said, and Croft has always been a greedy one. This is more than enough. This is irrefutable. The plan they devised was simple and direct. They would not just sue for the return of the ranch. They would press criminal charges for fraud and forgery. The next day, Thorne, accompanied by the county sheriff and Tess, walked into the stockman's bank. The effect was immediate. When confronted with the original documents and the clear evidence of forgery, Silas Croft's smug composure dissolved. His face went pale, and for the first time, Tess saw fear in his eyes. The fight was over before it began. Within a week, the foreclosure was reversed. The deed was returned to Tess's name, the fraudulent debt erased. Croft was arrested, his career and reputation in ruins. The bank, desperate to avoid a larger scandal, quietly settled, paying Tess a sum for damages that was more than enough to buy back the cattle and supplies she would need. The day she rode back to the ranch with the legal deed in her pocket felt like a homecoming more profound than any she had ever known. The house was empty, stripped of its life and warmth, but it was hers. The land was hers. The future was hers again. The rebuilding began immediately. It was hard, solitary work. Her first act was to move the safe, with a system of levers and rollers, using the mechanical knowledge her father had taught her. She managed to inch the iron behemoth from the office to the main room, placing it against the stone wall beside the hearth. It was no longer a symbol of what was lost, but a monument to what had been found. It was the heart of the house now, Then came the work of restoration. She started with the barn, repairing the stalls and reinforcing the loft. Mr. Abernathy showed up one morning with two of his ranch hands. He didn't say much. Figured you could use a hand with that roof, was all he said. They worked for 3 days, their hammers echoing in the clear mountain air. Mrs. Abernathy came with them, bringing hot meals and helping Tess scrub the floors of the house. Jed, the livery owner from Willow Creek, arrived with a wagon loaded with hay, a gift to get her started. Word of what she had done, of how she had outsmarted the bank, had spread through the valley. People who had been her father's friends, and even some who had only known him by reputation, began to appear. One by one they came, not with charity, but with offers of work and shared labor. A neighboring family helped her round up the stray cattle that had been sold but not yet moved. The blacksmith from town came to repair the hinges on the corral gate, refusing any payment. "Your father taught me how to properly temper steel," he said. "Consider it a debt repaid." Community coalesced, not through words of friendship, but through the shared rhythm of work. They were rebuilding more than a ranch. They were reaffirming a way of life, a code of mutual support that men like Croft could never understand. Tess worked alongside them, her hands growing calloused again, her muscles aching with the satisfying fatigue of honest labor. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. As the seasons turned, the Harlow Ranch slowly came back to life. Tess bought back her father's furniture from the neighbors who had purchased it at auction. Each piece returned like a memory finding its proper place. Mr. Abernathy brought back her mother's quilting frame, and his wife, Martha, sat with Tess one evening, showing her how to thread the needle, sharing stories of her own mother. The house, once empty and silent, began to fill with the small sounds of life. The crackle of the fire in the hearth, the bubbling of stew on the stove, the quiet ticking of the old mantel clock that a neighbor returned. The safe stood by the fireplace, its black iron surface warm to the touch. It was a silent, steady presence in the room, a reminder of the foundation upon which her new life was built. Tess was no longer just the girl who had lost everything. She was the woman who had fought for her home and won. People in the valley started calling her Iron Tess, a nickname born of respect for her resilience and her connection to the formidable safe. They came to her for advice, not on ranching, but on other things. A man whose well pump was broken, a woman whose sewing machine was jammed. They knew of her skill with mechanics, a legacy from her father she was now known for in her own right. She became part of the fabric of the community in a way she never had been before. Her name was known. When she rode into Willow Creek for supplies, people greeted her on the street. Jed, the livery owner, would have a fresh horse ready for her. The general store owner would set aside the best cuts of bacon. These were small rituals, quiet acknowledgments of her place in the world. She had earned her belonging not through birth, but through grit and competence. The ranch thrived under her care. She was a good manager, cautious and practical. She didn't seek to expand aggressively as others had. She focused on quality, on building a smaller, stronger herd that could withstand the harsh winters. She mended fences, cleared new pasture, and paid her bills in cash, keeping her own meticulous ledger just as her father had. Her father had built the ranch, but she was the one who saved it. She transformed it from a burden of debt into a living, breathing place of work and refuge. It was no longer just her father's legacy. It was hers. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after she had opened the safe, Elias Thorne rode out from Bozeman. He dismounted and accepted a cup of coffee, sitting with her on the porch that the auctioneer had once stood upon. "I saw an interesting thing in town," he said. "The Stockman's Bank has been sold. New ownership from back east. They say the scandal was too much for the old board." Tess nodded, looking out at the golden leaves of the cottonwoods along the creek. "Good," she said simply. "And I have something for you," Thorne said, pulling a small, heavy object from his saddlebag. It was the ornate brass dial from the bank's front door vault. The new owners are installing a modern vault. They were going to throw this away. I thought you might have a use for it. Tess took it. It was heavy, beautifully machined. She thought of her father and his fascination with such things. "Thank you, Elias," she said. "I know just the place for it." The unwanted thing, the symbol of the institution that had tried to destroy her, was now just a piece of brass, a mechanical curiosity. Its power was gone. That evening she placed the brass dial on the mantelpiece, right next to the small velvet-lined box from her father's safe. The ranch was quiet, filled with a sense of deep, abiding peace. She was home. Tess stood by the hearth, the warmth of the fire on her face. The room was clean and orderly, filled with the presence of things that had been lost and then found. Her gaze fell upon the two objects on the mantelpiece. On one side was the small velvet box from her father, which now held her mother's wedding ring and the little ball-peen hammer he had made for her. It was a container of love, memory, and the tools of creation. On the other side sat the heavy brass dial from the bank vault, a relic of the institution that had underestimated her. It was no longer a symbol of power, but a testament to her victory. Between them, solid and immovable, stood the great black safe. It was the bridge between her past and her future, between her father's legacy and her own. She thought of Silas Croft, a man who saw value only in numbers on a page, who believed he could erase a life with a forged signature. He had looked at her and seen a helpless girl. He had looked at the safe and seen a useless piece of scrap iron. He had failed to understand the true nature of value, the strength that resides not in wealth, but in skill, in love, in memory. He couldn't see the story locked inside the steel. Her father had seen it. He had known her, and he had trusted her. He had left her not a fortune, but something far more valuable. A challenge, a test of the very skills he had taught her. He had given her the chance to save herself. She ran a hand over the safe's cool, smooth door. The combination 27511483 was etched in her mind, a sequence as familiar as her own name. It was the combination to her father's trust, the key to her own resilience. She looked around the room, at the sturdy furniture, the tight-chinked logs of the walls, the land stretching out beyond the windows under a sky full of stars. This was a place built by good tools in steady hands. Her father's hands had built the house. Her hands had rebuilt the life within it. Tess Harlow was 24 now. She had started with nothing but $2 silver and a small roll of tools. With those $2, she had bought a worthless, uncrackable safe. It was the best $2 she had ever spent. What began as the symbol of her complete and total loss had become the cornerstone of her home, her dignity, and her belonging in the world. Thank you for joining us for Tess's story. If her resilience and quiet strength resonated with you, please consider sharing this story with someone who might appreciate it. It helps our small channel find the people who need these stories most. And a question for you to reflect on. Is there something in your life that others have dismissed as worthless, but which you know holds a deeper value? Let us know in the comments below. We read everyone.